Sometimes the most important call in America isn't made to a president. Sometimes it's made to the one person who never expected anyone to remember his name. At exactly 5:47 on a rainy Tuesday morning, the phone rang inside a tiny duplex tucked between two aging brick buildings on the quiet edge of Columbus, Ohio. Ethan Walker was already awake. Men who spent their lives cleaning other people's messes rarely slept late. He had packed his lunch before sunrise, poured black coffee into a faded stainless steel thermos, and carefully polished the same pair of work shoes he had worn for nearly 6 years. The kitchen smelled faintly of fresh toast and lemon cleaner, the ordinary scent of a life built not on comfort, but on discipline. The digital clock above the microwave blinked softly as the old landline rang again. Ethan frowned. Almost no one called that number anymore. His daughter, Hannah, always texted. The school district emailed. Bills arrived online. He wiped his hands on a dish towel before answering. Hello. His voice carried the quiet steadiness of a man who had learned that raising it rarely solved anything. There was a brief pause before a calm, professional voice spoke. Good morning. May I speak with Mr. Ethan Walker? This is Ethan. Mr. Walker, my name is Caroline Brooks. I'm calling from the executive office in Washington, D.C. We're hoping to arrange a meeting regarding your extraordinary contribution to the life of one of our senior advisors. Ethan blinked. Rain tapped gently against the kitchen window. Somewhere outside, a delivery truck rolled through puddles, its tires hissing against wet pavement. He looked at the old coffee maker as though it might explain what he had just heard. I think you may have the wrong number, he answered politely. No, sir, the woman replied with surprising warmth. We've spent several months making sure we had the right one. Ethan let out the smallest laugh, embarrassed more than amused. I'm a school janitor. Another pause followed, but this one felt different. Yes, Mr. Walker, she answered. We know. The line remained silent for just a heartbeat, yet somehow that silence weighed more than any explanation. Ethan stared through the rain-streaked window toward the small maple tree growing beside his driveway. Its leaves shimmered under the gray morning sky, bending without breaking each time the wind passed through. It reminded him strangely of people. Some survived storms because they learned how to bend. I honestly think there's been a misunderstanding, Ethan said. I've never worked in government. You didn't need to, Caroline answered gently. Someone who does has never forgotten what you did. Ethan lowered himself into the kitchen chair without realizing he had done so. The wooden legs creaked softly beneath him. His lunchbox rested beside the front door. Inside sat a turkey sandwich, an apple, and 2 homemade oatmeal cookies wrapped carefully in wax paper, exactly as they had every Tuesday for years. He had no idea that those simple habits were about to become part of a story far bigger than himself. Mr. Walker, Caroline continued, would tomorrow afternoon be convenient if representatives visited your home? Ethan rubbed his forehead. Representatives? Yes, sir. From Washington? Yes, sir. He almost smiled again, convinced one of Hannah's co-workers must have arranged an elaborate prank. Can I ask who this is really about? The answer arrived with quiet certainty. A young man named Noah Brooks. Ethan's hand froze around the receiver. The name reached across 14 years as easily as if no time had passed at all. For a brief moment, the rain disappeared. The kitchen disappeared. Even the steady ticking of the clock faded into memory. All he could see was a thin boy sitting alone beneath a broken bus shelter on the first cold morning of November, wearing shoes 2 sizes too small and pretending not to be hungry. Ethan closed his eyes. He had not spoken that name aloud in over a decade. Noah, he whispered, almost to himself. He asked us to find you, Caroline said. He said none of us would understand who he is today until we first understood who you chose to be when no one else was watching. Ethan's throat tightened, not from pride, but from confusion. He remembered no heroic moment, no grand sacrifice, no life-changing speech. He remembered sandwiches split in half, warm gloves left anonymously on a park bench, library books returned on someone else's card, quiet conversations before sunrise. That was all. At least, that was all he had ever believed it to be. Outside, the rain finally began to ease. A narrow beam of early morning light slipped through the clouds and settled across the worn kitchen table where Ethan still sat holding the phone. He had spent most of his life believing kindness disappeared the moment it was given, like footprints washed away after a storm. He was about to discover that some acts never disappear at all. Some simply travel farther than we can ever imagine before finding their way home. Ethan barely remembered hanging up the phone. He stood in the middle of the kitchen for several minutes, listening to the refrigerator hum as though ordinary sounds could anchor him back to reality. Eventually, habit won over disbelief. He picked up his lunchbox, locked the front door, and climbed into his aging blue pickup truck. The engine hesitated before coming to life, just as it always had. Some things stayed dependable precisely because they had survived so many years. The drive to Jefferson Elementary took just under 20 minutes. Morning traffic crawled through wet intersections while windshield wipers swept away the last traces of rain. Ethan parked in the same corner of the employee lot where he had parked nearly every weekday for the past 14 years. He nodded politely to the crossing guard, smiled at the cafeteria manager unloading fresh produce, and unlocked the side entrance before most teachers had even arrived. The familiar scent of floor wax, fresh coffee, crayons, and old books greeted him like an old friend. To Ethan, schools always smelled like possibility. Every polished hallway meant another child would begin the day believing tomorrow might be better than yesterday. He quietly filled his cleaning cart with paper towels, glass cleaner, disinfectant, and fresh trash liners before beginning his routine exactly the same way he always did. He checked every classroom door. He straightened every welcome mat. He picked up every pencil lying forgotten in the hallway. Nobody had ever asked him to do those little things. He simply believed children deserved to walk into a place that told them someone cared before a single lesson even began. Around 7:15, Principal Melissa Carter stepped into the main hallway carrying a stack of folders. She smiled the moment she spotted him polishing the front entrance windows. "Good morning, Ethan." He looked up with his usual gentle smile. "Morning, Melissa. Looks like the weather finally decided to cooperate." She laughed softly. "For today, at least." She studied him for a second before tilting her head. "You look distracted." Ethan hesitated. "I got a strange phone call this morning." "Everything all right?" "I honestly do not know." He almost mentioned Washington, but decided against it. Saying the words aloud still sounded impossible. Melissa offered a reassuring nod. "Well, if anyone deserves good news, it is probably you." Ethan smiled politely, but said nothing. Compliments had always made him uncomfortable. As the first buses arrived, the building transformed almost instantly. Tiny sneakers squeaked across polished tile. Lockers clicked open. Teachers greeted sleepy students with cheerful voices. The school awakened like a small town beginning another ordinary day. Ethan moved quietly through it all, invisible to most, appreciated by a few, greeting every child exactly the same way. "Good morning. Glad you made it. Have a great day." Those simple words often earned bigger smiles than people realized. Near the kindergarten hallway, a little boy stood alone clutching a backpack nearly as large as himself. Tears shimmered in his eyes as parents hurried past toward work. Ethan recognized the look immediately. Fear always looked smaller than it felt. He crouched until they were eye level. "First day?" The boy nodded without speaking. Ethan smiled warmly. "You know something? The bravest people I have ever met were usually scared first." The little boy looked up. "Really? Really? Being brave does not mean you are never afraid. It means you keep walking anyway." The child tightened his grip on the backpack straps before slowly nodding. A teacher arrived moments later, gently taking the boy toward his classroom. Before disappearing around the corner, the child looked back and offered Ethan the smallest wave. Ethan returned it with the same quiet smile. Moments like that never appeared in newspapers. Nobody applauded them. Yet they filled his days with a quiet purpose stronger than recognition ever could. During his morning break, Ethan sat alone on a bench outside beside the faculty parking lot. He unwrapped one of the oatmeal cookies Hannah had baked over the weekend. She insisted he always carried two because, as she often joked, someone would eventually need the other one more than he did. Ethan smiled at the thought. She had inherited her late mother's generous heart without ever realizing it. As he looked across the playground, memories drifted back without warning. Another cold morning. Another lonely bench. Another child pretending hunger did not exist. Noah had never asked for food. He had only smiled politely whenever Ethan walked by carrying his lunch. Somehow that quiet dignity had spoken louder than any plea for help ever could. Ethan remembered the first time he decided to split his sandwich in half. It had not felt extraordinary then. It had simply felt right. Watching children laugh across the playground now, he wondered where that frightened boy had found the strength to keep believing in tomorrow. He still had no answers, only memories. And somewhere hundreds of miles away, someone inside the nation's highest offices apparently remembered those same mornings far more clearly than he ever imagined. That afternoon, after the final school bus disappeared beyond the intersection, Ethan remained in the hallway a little longer than usual. The building slowly settled into its familiar evening quiet. Classroom lights blinked off one by one. The distant hum of the heating system filled the empty corridors. A forgotten red mitten rested beneath a bench outside the library, and Ethan picked it up carefully before placing it in the lost and found, just as he had done with hundreds of small treasures over the years. It was strange how ordinary moments often carried the greatest memories. As he pushed his cleaning cart toward the front entrance, the reflection in the polished floor seemed to pull him backward through time. 14 years earlier, the hallway had looked different. His hair had been darker, and Hannah had still been young enough to leave little crayon drawings inside his lunchbox every Monday morning. She always drew the same picture: a smiling sun, a blue house, the words, "Have a good day, Daddy." Those pictures had often been the brightest part of difficult weeks. Back then, Ethan worked 2 jobs. He cleaned the elementary school before sunrise and another office building after sunset. Every dollar mattered. Every gallon of gasoline mattered. Every grocery receipt was folded carefully into an old envelope on the kitchen counter. Yet somehow he never felt poor. Tired, certainly. Lonely after losing his wife, often. But never poor. He still had purpose waiting for him every morning when Hannah smiled across the breakfast table. It was during one of those November mornings that everything quietly changed. The wind had arrived early that year, carrying the sharp bite of approaching winter through downtown Columbus. Leaves scraped across the sidewalks like dry paper, while people hurried past wearing heavy coats and looking anywhere except at one another. Ethan parked beside the old transit station before walking the final block toward the school. He always arrived early because parking was free before 6:30. His lunchbox swung gently beside him as steam rose from the lid of his coffee thermos. Halfway down Maple Avenue, he noticed someone sitting beneath the cracked plastic roof of an aging bus shelter. At first glance, it looked like another commuter waiting for the first route of the morning. But something felt different. The figure was too small, too still. Ethan slowed his pace. A boy sat with his knees pulled tightly against his chest beneath a thin gray sweatshirt that offered little protection from the cold. His backpack leaned against the bench beside him, faded almost white around the edges from years of use. The sneakers on his feet were badly worn, one sole beginning to separate near the toe. Yet what Ethan noticed most was not the clothing. It was the way the boy watched people without asking anything from them. He never reached out his hand, never called after anyone, never tried to attract sympathy. He simply lowered his eyes whenever someone looked his direction. A businessman hurried by speaking loudly into his phone. 2 college students laughed while carrying fresh coffee. A woman walked her golden retriever across the crosswalk. Everyone noticed the boy. No one stopped. Ethan hesitated. His watch reminded him he still had 20 minutes before unlocking the school. He could keep walking. Most people probably would have. After all, he did not know the child. He had responsibilities. Bills. A daughter waiting at home. Yet something inside him refused to leave. Quietly, he walked toward the shelter. The boy glanced up, preparing himself for another stranger who would probably ask him to move along. Instead, Ethan offered a gentle smile. "Good morning." The boy blinked, surprised by the greeting. After a moment, he answered softly, "Morning." Ethan nodded toward the empty bench. "Mind if I sit for a minute?" The boy shrugged politely. "It is a free bench." Ethan smiled at the unexpected answer and sat beside him. The cold plastic creaked beneath their weight. For several seconds, neither of them spoke. Cars rolled through the intersection. A city bus stopped across the street before pulling away again. Finally, Ethan unscrewed his thermos and took a sip of coffee before opening his lunchbox. Inside rested a turkey sandwich cut neatly into 2 halves, an apple, a small bag of pretzels, and 1 chocolate chip cookie Hannah had baked the night before. Ethan looked at the sandwich, then at the boy. "Did you have breakfast?" The child answered exactly as Ethan would remember for years afterward. "I will be all right." It was not the answer of someone who had eaten. It was the answer of someone protecting the last piece of dignity he still believed belonged to him. Ethan understood immediately because life had taught him the difference. Without another word, he picked up one half of the sandwich, wrapped it carefully in a napkin, and held it out. "Then help me," he said with an easy smile. "My daughter keeps telling me these sandwiches are too big for one person." The boy looked at the food, then back at Ethan. His eyes filled not with excitement, but with hesitation. "Are you sure?" Ethan nodded once. "Absolutely." After a long moment, the boy accepted the sandwich with both hands as though it were something far more valuable than lunch. "Thank you," he whispered. Ethan simply smiled and took a bite from his own half. Neither of them realized that the quiet decision made beneath that weathered bus shelter would become the first page of a story that neither time nor the highest office in the country would ever forget. The next morning, Ethan arrived at the bus shelter 5 minutes earlier than usual without admitting to himself that he hoped the boy would still be there. Dawn spread slowly across the eastern sky, painting the clouds with pale shades of silver and gold, while a cold breeze carried the scent of damp pavement and freshly brewed coffee from a nearby diner. The shelter looked exactly as it had the day before, except this time the boy was already awake, sitting quietly with an old paperback book resting on his knees. He looked up as Ethan approached and offered the smallest smile. It was not the smile of someone who expected kindness. It was the smile of someone who had almost forgotten what kindness looked like. "Good morning," Ethan said. "Morning," the boy answered. "Did you sleep all right?" The boy hesitated before nodding once. Ethan recognized the answer for what it was. Sometimes people answered with hope instead of truth because hope hurt less. He sat beside him again, opened his lunchbox, and split his breakfast exactly as he had the day before. This time the boy accepted the sandwich without protest. "Thank you," he said quietly. "You are welcome." They ate in comfortable silence while the city slowly awakened around them. Delivery trucks rolled past. Bicycle tires whispered across the sidewalk. Somewhere in the distance, church bells announced the half hour. Ethan noticed the paperback resting beside the boy. The cover had been repaired several times with clear tape. "You like reading?" he asked. The boy looked down at the worn book and nodded. "Libraries are warm," he answered. "Nobody bothers you if you are reading." Ethan smiled gently. "What is your favorite subject?" "History." "Really? History reminds me that people can survive hard times." Ethan looked at him with quiet surprise. Those words sounded far older than the child who spoke them. "What is your name?" he asked softly. The boy hesitated, studying Ethan's face as though deciding whether names were something that could safely be trusted. Finally he answered, "Noah." Ethan extended his hand with an easy smile. "I am Ethan." Noah shook it carefully. His handshake was polite, respectful, almost formal. It was the handshake of a boy who had been raised with good manners before life became complicated. From that morning forward, an unspoken routine quietly formed between them. Ethan never arrived empty-handed. Some mornings it was half of his sandwich. Other mornings it was an extra banana, a carton of milk, or a warm muffin he picked up on sale before work. He never presented the food as charity. Instead, he always found a reason to share it. "Hannah packed too much again. I cannot finish all of this myself. You would actually be helping me." Noah understood exactly what Ethan was doing, and because he understood, he accepted each meal with dignity instead of embarrassment. As autumn faded toward winter, Ethan noticed small details about the boy that others overlooked. Noah always thanked every cashier who allowed him to warm his hands inside a convenience store for a minute. He always picked up litter around the shelter before leaving. When an elderly woman dropped a grocery bag crossing the street, Noah quietly gathered every apple before anyone else even slowed down. He asked for nothing in return. One Friday morning, Ethan arrived carrying an old knit hat and a pair of insulated gloves that Hannah had carefully washed the night before. "These belonged to my cousin years ago," Ethan said casually. "They have been sitting in a closet doing absolutely nothing." Noah looked at the winter clothes without reaching for them. "They still look new." "Exactly," Ethan replied. "That seems like a terrible waste." Noah lowered his eyes. "I cannot pay you back." Ethan smiled with the same calm expression that never carried even a trace of pity. "I did not ask you to." The boy slowly pulled on the gloves. They fit almost perfectly. For the first time since Ethan had met him, Noah laughed quietly after flexing his fingers inside the warm fabric. It was not a loud laugh. It barely lasted 2 seconds. Yet somehow it brightened the gray November morning more than the sunrise had. Ethan laughed with him. Much better, he said. Noah nodded. I forgot what warm hands felt like. Ethan did not answer immediately. He simply looked toward the busy street where hundreds of people hurried through another ordinary morning without realizing that extraordinary moments often happened in complete silence. He had not rescued anyone. He had not solved every problem. He had simply chosen to notice a child everyone else had learned to walk past. Sometimes dignity began with something as small as remembering another person's name. Sometimes hope arrived wrapped inside half a sandwich and an old pair of gloves. Neither of them knew that every quiet conversation beneath that weathered bus shelter was slowly shaping a future that would one day reach far beyond the streets of Columbus, touching places neither of them could yet imagine. Winter settled over Columbus with quiet determination. The trees along Maple Avenue stood bare against pale morning skies, and frost traced delicate patterns across the glass walls of the old bus shelter before sunrise. Ethan's routine never changed. He arrived early, carrying the same lunchbox, the same thermos of black coffee, and the same calm smile that expected nothing in return. Noah was almost always there first now, usually reading another worn library book beneath the flickering shelter light. Some mornings they talked about history. Other mornings they sat in comfortable silence while the city slowly awakened around them. Ethan never asked where Noah slept. Noah never asked why Ethan kept coming back. Somehow both understood that trust did not begin with questions. It began with consistency. One Thursday morning, Ethan noticed Noah carefully copying vocabulary, words into a weathered notebook with a pencil worn nearly to the eraser. Homework? Ethan asked with a smile. Noah looked embarrassed. Not exactly. I borrow old textbooks from the library when they replace them. I like learning new words. Ethan nodded with genuine admiration. Words open doors that money cannot always unlock. Noah smiled faintly. I hope so. Before Ethan could answer, two maintenance workers from a nearby office building walked past the shelter carrying steaming cups of coffee. One slowed when he noticed Ethan handing Noah a fresh breakfast burrito wrapped in foil. The man shook his head and laughed loud enough for both of them to hear. There he goes again, feeding another drifter before work. His coworker smirked. Careful, buddy. You keep doing that, and the whole city will line up outside your house. They both laughed before continuing down the sidewalk. Noah immediately lowered the burrito. I am sorry, he whispered. People should not make fun of you because of me. Ethan simply leaned back against the cold bench. People are allowed to have opinions. Noah stared at the sidewalk. Does it not bother you? Ethan watched the morning sunlight slowly brighten the buildings across the street before answering. Not nearly as much as walking away from someone who needs kindness. Noah remained silent. Ethan continued gently. Respect is not something you earn by following the crowd. Sometimes you keep your dignity by quietly walking in the opposite direction. Noah absorbed every word without replying. The conversation lingered in his thoughts long after Ethan left for work. Unfortunately, the comments did not end there. Over the following weeks, more people began noticing the quiet routine beneath the bus shelter. Some offered approving smiles. Others were less generous. One parent dropping off children near the elementary school recognized Ethan and mentioned to another volunteer that the school janitor spent his mornings feeding a homeless boy downtown. By afternoon, the story had grown larger than the truth. Someone suggested Ethan was bringing strangers around the school. Someone else claimed he was becoming too personally involved. Rumors traveled faster than facts, as they often do. A few days later, Principal Melissa Carter found Ethan replacing light bulbs in the media center. Her expression was thoughtful but kind. Do you have a minute? She asked. Ethan set the ladder safely against the wall. Of course. Melissa folded her hands. I received a phone call from a concerned parent. Ethan listened quietly. They said you have been spending time with a homeless child before work. That is true. They were worried. Ethan nodded respectfully. I understand. Melissa studied him for a long moment. Would you like to explain? Ethan never sounded defensive. His name is Noah. He likes history books. He always says thank you. He has never asked me for money. Sometimes we share breakfast before I come to work. Melissa blinked. That is all. Ethan smiled gently. That seems like enough. The principal looked down briefly before meeting his eyes again. I thought there might be more. Ethan chuckled softly. There usually is not. She smiled despite herself. I know your character, Ethan. I simply needed to ask. I appreciate that. Before walking away, Melissa paused. You know, most people spend a great deal of time trying to look compassionate. Ethan adjusted the box of light bulbs beneath his arm. Looking compassionate and being compassionate are not always the same thing. Melissa watched him disappear down the hallway, pushing his cleaning cart with the same quiet pace as every other day. She realized something then. The strongest people she had ever known rarely announced their goodness. They simply practiced it until it became ordinary. Meanwhile, across town, Noah sat alone beneath the familiar shelter reading one of his library books. He could still hear the laughter of strangers echoing in his memory. For the first time in many months, he wondered whether he should disappear from Ethan's life altogether. He could endure another cold winter. He could endure hunger. What he could not bear was becoming the reason the one man who treated him with dignity might someday lose the respect of others. As the afternoon sun faded behind gray clouds, Noah quietly closed his book and stared toward the street where Ethan would normally appear the following morning. A difficult decision was beginning to take shape inside the heart of a boy who believed gratitude sometimes meant learning how to walk away. The following morning, the wind arrived before the sun. It pushed dry leaves across the empty sidewalks and rattled the loose plastic panel on the old bus shelter with a hollow rhythm that echoed through the quiet street. Ethan parked his truck in the same spot as always, lifted his lunchbox from the passenger seat, and walked toward the corner with an easy smile already forming on his face. For the first time in months, the bench was empty. He slowed his pace, looking behind the shelter as though Noah might simply be tying a shoe or searching for a dropped pencil. There was no one. Only the cold morning air and yesterday's newspaper tumbling across the sidewalk. Ethan sat down anyway. He waited 5 minutes. Then 10. City buses arrived and departed. Office workers hurried toward downtown, carrying travel mugs and briefcases. A woman walked her Labrador past the shelter exactly as she did every Thursday. No one never appeared. Ethan finally stood, adjusting the strap of his lunchbox before heading toward school. He told himself the boy had probably found a warmer place for the morning. It was a comforting explanation, but somehow it never settled in his heart. The next day the bench remained empty again. So did the day after that. By the end of the week, the silence beneath the shelter felt louder than the traffic surrounding it. Ethan continued bringing an extra sandwich every morning anyway. He would unwrap it, wait a few minutes, then quietly eat only half before placing the remaining portion inside a paper bag and leaving it on the bench. Sometimes it disappeared before he returned the following afternoon. Sometimes it remained untouched until the evening rain soaked through the paper. He never knew whether Noah had come after he left or whether someone else had needed it more. He simply kept coming. At school, Hannah noticed the change almost immediately. One evening, while helping wash dishes after dinner, she watched her father staring thoughtfully through the kitchen window. "You miss your friend," she said gently. Ethan looked toward her with a faint smile. "I suppose I do." Hannah dried another plate before speaking again. "Do you think he is all right?" Ethan answered honestly. "I hope so." She walked over and rested a hand lightly on his arm. "You always told me that helping someone does not mean you get to decide how the story ends." Ethan smiled. "Your mother used to tell me that first." Hannah laughed softly. "Then I guess I learned from both of you." The conversation lingered with Ethan long after dinner. The following Saturday, instead of sleeping an extra hour, he drove across downtown searching places Noah had once mentioned without realizing he had mentioned them. He visited the public library where the boy borrowed history books. A librarian remembered him immediately. "The quiet young reader?" she asked. Ethan nodded hopefully. She smiled sadly. "I have not seen him in over 2 weeks." Ethan thanked her and continued searching. He checked the small neighborhood park where Noah sometimes read beneath a large oak tree. He stopped by the church that offered free community breakfasts every Saturday morning. He even spoke with an elderly volunteer who recognized Noah from the description. "Very polite boy," the volunteer said. "Always cleaned his table before leaving." "Have you seen him recently?" Ethan asked. The volunteer slowly shook his head. "No. I have been praying someone gave that child a better place to be." Ethan whispered, "So have I." As winter deepened, the routine that had once brought quiet joy slowly transformed into quiet hope. Every morning, he still carried 2 sandwiches. Every morning, he still glanced toward the bus shelter before unlocking the school doors. Every morning, he silently wished that a familiar smile would appear from around the corner, holding another worn library book beneath one arm. Weeks passed. Christmas lights appeared across Columbus, glowing warmly in neighborhood windows while fresh snow softened the streets overnight. Children filled the school hallways with excitement about vacations and presents waiting beneath decorated trees. Ethan smiled with them, polished classroom floors, hung paper snowflakes for teachers, and greeted every student with the same gentle warmth. Yet whenever he stepped outside before sunrise, his eyes always searched the empty bench first. On the final morning before winter break, he found something resting exactly where Noah used to sit. It was a small library card tucked carefully beneath a smooth gray stone so the wind could not carry it away. Folded inside was a single sheet of notebook paper covered with neat handwriting. Ethan unfolded it slowly, his fingers trembling from something deeper than the cold. The message was short. "Thank you for treating me like I mattered. I could never repay you, so the only thing I can do is become someone who proves you were right to believe in me. Please do not look for me. You already gave me the courage to keep walking." Ethan read the words again as snowflakes drifted quietly through the pale morning light. He folded the note with extraordinary care and placed it inside his wallet beside Hannah's childhood drawings. Then he looked toward the empty street and smiled through eyes glistening with emotion. Whoever Noah might become, Ethan realized the boy had already taken with him the one gift that could never be lost. He had learned that dignity given freely has a remarkable way of becoming dignity carried forward. 14 years slipped quietly past, not with dramatic turning points, but with ordinary mornings that slowly became extraordinary memories. The seasons continued their faithful rhythm across Columbus. Spring returned with flowering dogwoods outside Jefferson Elementary. Summer painted the sidewalks with golden sunlight. Autumn scattered crimson leaves across the playground, and winter once again covered the city in soft blankets of snow. Through every season, Ethan Walker remained exactly where people expected to find him. Before sunrise, he unlocked the school doors. Before the first bell, he polished the hallways until they reflected the morning light. Before every child entered the building, he walked each corridor, making certain everything was ready for another day of learning. His hair had turned almost completely silver now, and the lines around his eyes had deepened, not from bitterness, but from years of smiling at children who needed to believe that school was a safe place. Hannah had grown into a confident young woman, graduated from college, and begun teaching second grade only 20 miles away. Every Sunday afternoon, she still visited her father for lunch, bringing homemade casseroles and insisting he stop pretending frozen dinners counted as proper meals. Ethan always laughed, promising to eat better, and usually forgot by Wednesday. Some habits were difficult to change. Others were not worth changing at all. The folded note Noah had left years earlier never left Ethan's wallet. The edges had softened with time, and the ink had faded slightly from being unfolded on quiet evenings whenever life felt especially heavy. He never showed it to anyone. It was not because he wished to keep it secret. It simply felt personal, like a conversation that still belonged only to two people sitting beneath an old bus shelter on a cold November morning. Occasionally, he wondered where Noah had gone. Had someone adopted him? Had he finished school? Had he found the future he once dreamed about while reading borrowed history books beneath flickering shelter lights? Ethan never searched for answers online. He never hired investigators. He believed the boy's final request deserved to be honored. Sometimes loving someone meant trusting them enough to let them walk toward their own future. At Jefferson Elementary, generations of students passed through the same hallways Ethan quietly cared for every day. Children who once waved shyly to the friendly janitor eventually returned years later as parents bringing their own sons and daughters to kindergarten orientation. Many recognized him immediately. "Mr. Walker, you probably do not remember me." They would begin with a smile. Ethan almost always did. He remembered missing front teeth, favorite dinosaurs, broken shoelaces, nervous first days, and science fair victories. Names mattered to him because people mattered to him. One rainy afternoon, a young father approached while picking up his daughter after school. "You probably never knew this," the man said, "but when I was in third grade, my parents were getting divorced. Every morning you smiled and said you were glad I came to school. I never told anyone, but those 5 words helped me get through that year." Ethan looked genuinely surprised. "I only said good morning." The father smiled warmly. "No, Mr. Walker. You made me believe someone noticed I was there." After the man walked away, Ethan stood quietly beneath the covered entrance listening to rain patter against the sidewalk. He thought about Noah, then about hundreds of children whose names had slowly blended together across the years. Most people believed changing the world required remarkable talent, wealth, or influence. Ethan had gradually come to believe something very different. The world often changed one unnoticed conversation at a time. One encouraging sentence, one shared sandwich, one patient smile offered to someone carrying burdens nobody else could see. Late one evening after finishing his rounds, Ethan switched off the final classroom lights and paused in the empty hallway. The polished floors reflected rows of ceiling lights stretching into the distance like stars across a quiet sky. He smiled to himself, remembering something Noah once said. "History reminds me that people can survive hard times." Ethan whispered the words softly into the empty building before locking the front doors behind him. He had no idea that hundreds of miles away, inside one of the most secure office buildings in the nation, a young man in a Navy suit had just finished an important meeting. On his desk rested a leather notebook containing many pages of policy recommendations, economic reports, and national priorities. Tucked carefully inside the front cover, protected as though it were priceless, was a faded library card and the memory of half a turkey sandwich shared by a quiet school janitor who never asked for recognition, never expected gratitude, and never realized that the greatest investment he would ever make had not been measured in dollars, but in dignity. The following Wednesday began like every other workday Ethan could remember, yet something invisible had already begun to change. Before dawn, he unlocked the front entrance of Jefferson Elementary, switched on the hallway lights, and paused for a moment as the familiar glow reflected across the freshly polished floors. The building was quiet except for the gentle hum of the ventilation system and the distant ticking of the old clock above the main office. Ethan smiled to himself. He had always loved these few peaceful minutes before children filled the hallways with laughter and footsteps. They reminded him that every new day arrived as a clean page waiting to be written. He wheeled his cleaning cart toward the front lobby, carefully straightened a welcome rug that had shifted overnight, and placed a small vase of fresh wildflowers on the receptionist's desk. Nobody had asked him to do that. He simply believed schools should feel warm before they felt organized. Around 7 o'clock, Principal Melissa Carter entered carrying her usual travel mug of coffee. She stopped almost immediately when she noticed two unfamiliar black sport utility vehicles parked across the street. Their engines remained running, and several professionally dressed men and women stood quietly near the sidewalk, speaking into small wireless earpieces. Melissa frowned with curiosity. "Are we expecting visitors today?" Ethan glanced through the glass doors. "Not that I know of." Before either of them could wonder further, Ethan's cell phone vibrated inside his pocket. The caller identification displayed a Washington, District of Columbia area code. He answered politely. "This is Ethan Walker." The same calm voice from several mornings earlier greeted him. "Good morning, Mr. Walker. This is Caroline Brooks. I hope we are not interrupting your work." Ethan looked toward the mysterious vehicles outside. "I have a feeling you might be nearby." Caroline laughed softly. "We are. Our team has arrived a little earlier than planned. We wanted to confirm that this is still a convenient time before entering the school." Ethan rubbed the back of his neck awkwardly. "You really came. We promised we would." He remained silent for a moment before quietly replying, "Please come in." Less than 2 minutes later, the front doors opened. For visitors entered the lobby without fanfare or unnecessary attention. Their clothing was elegant but understated. Their expressions carried professionalism rather than importance. The woman leading the group stepped forward first. She extended her hand with a warm smile. "Mr. Walker, thank you for meeting us." Ethan shook her hand gently. "It is nice to finally meet you in person." Caroline looked around the spotless entrance before smiling again. "I had a feeling this place would look exactly like this." Ethan seemed puzzled. "Like what?" "Cared for." Melissa quietly introduced herself, and the visitors greeted her with equal respect before Caroline reached into a leather portfolio and carefully removed a cream-colored envelope embossed with the seal of the executive office. She held it with both hands before offering it to Ethan. "This is an official invitation," she explained. "A ceremony has been scheduled in Washington next Friday afternoon." Someone very important requested that you be our guest of honor. Ethan stared at the envelope without opening it. I think there must still be some misunderstanding. Caroline gently shook her head. There is not. One member of the delegation placed a slim folder on the reception desk. Inside were several photographs, newspaper clippings, academic awards, and official biographies. Ethan hesitated before looking down. The first photograph showed a confident young man wearing a navy suit while speaking at a university podium. The smile was older. The face was leaner, but the eyes were unmistakable. Ethan whispered only one word. Noah. Caroline nodded. He has spoken about you for many years. Ethan slowly turned another page. There were photographs of Noah graduating from high school with highest honors, earning scholarships, studying public policy, receiving national academic awards, and eventually standing beside respected government leaders during official events. Every page represented years Ethan had never witnessed. Every achievement told a story he had quietly hoped might someday exist. Then he reached the final page. Tucked inside a clear protective sleeve rested a faded photocopy of an old library card. Ethan immediately recognized it. His eyes widened. He kept it. Caroline smiled. He carries the original with him everywhere he goes. The lobby became completely silent. Even the students arriving outside seemed distant for a brief moment. Ethan carefully closed the folder, his hands trembling slightly. I only shared breakfast with a lonely boy. Caroline looked at him with quiet admiration before answering. No, Mr. Walker. You shared dignity with a child who had almost forgotten he deserved it. The breakfast lasted a few minutes. The dignity lasted a lifetime. That is why we came. The remainder of that morning passed like a dream Ethan could not quite wake from. Children hurried through the front doors with backpacks bouncing against their shoulders, laughing with friends, waving to teachers, completely unaware that history was quietly unfolding only a few feet away. Ethan excused himself from the visitors with an apologetic smile. I still have classrooms to prepare. Caroline nodded with genuine respect. That is exactly why Noah said we would find you working. Ethan picked up the handle of his cleaning cart and continued down the hallway exactly as he had every other morning. The delegation watched in silence as he stopped to help a first grader zip up a winter coat, returned a lost lunchbox to the office, and straightened a bulletin board that had come loose overnight. One member of the delegation quietly whispered, "He really does not know how extraordinary he is." Caroline smiled. That is precisely why he is. By lunchtime, word had spread through the school that important officials from Washington were visiting. Nobody knew the reason. Teachers exchanged curious glances in the faculty lounge. Office staff peeked discreetly through the front windows whenever another government vehicle arrived. Even the students noticed something unusual was happening. During recess, a fourth-grade boy pointed toward the parking lot. Who are those people? His friend asked. Maybe somebody famous is coming. Ethan overheard the conversation while emptying a recycling bin and simply smiled to himself. Fame had never interested him. Finishing the day. Well, always had. Shortly after lunch, Melissa knocked gently on the custodial office door. Ethan looked up from repairing a loose wheel on his cleaning cart. Everything all right? He asked. Melissa laughed softly. I think I should be asking you that. She handed him a garment bag carefully protected inside clear plastic. This was delivered for you. Ethan looked puzzled. What is it? Apparently someone believes you should not travel to Washington wearing your work uniform. Ethan unzipped the bag slightly. Inside hung a beautifully tailored navy blue suit with a crisp white dress shirt, a silver tie, polished leather shoes, and a handwritten note attached to the hanger. His eyes settled on the familiar handwriting almost immediately. Dear Ethan, it read. 14 years ago, you never cared what I looked like when you shared your breakfast. Please allow me the privilege of making sure you feel as respected as you always made me feel. With gratitude that words can never fully express, Noah. Ethan stood quietly for several moments before carefully folding the note and placing it beside the one already resting safely inside his wallet. Melissa watched him with moist eyes. Are you going to wear it? Ethan smiled gently. Only because I know refusing would probably hurt his feelings. They both laughed softly. That evening, after school dismissed, Ethan drove home carrying the garment bag over one shoulder. His modest duplex looked exactly as it always had, with neatly trimmed shrubs, a small American flag beside the front porch, and flower boxes Hannah insisted on planting every spring. Hannah's car was already in the driveway when he arrived. She stepped outside before he even reached the front steps. "Dad?" she called excitedly. "The internet is full of pictures from your school today. What in the world is happening?" Ethan shook his head with an embarrassed smile. "I'm still trying to figure that out myself." Inside the living room, he carefully laid the suit across the couch before telling Hannah everything from the mysterious phone call to the government delegation and finally Noah's handwritten note. She listened without interrupting, occasionally wiping tears from her eyes. When he finished, she quietly picked up the note and read it once more. "You always wondered if he was all right," she whispered. Ethan nodded. "I did." Hannah looked toward her father with deep affection. "He became exactly the person you hoped he would become." Ethan smiled thoughtfully. "No, he became exactly the person he chose to become." Hannah gently shook her head. "Maybe, but sometimes all someone needs is one person who believes they are worth becoming." Outside, evening settled peacefully over the neighborhood as porch lights flickered on one by one. Ethan stood beside the living room window holding Noah's note in one hand and gazing toward the quiet street, where nothing appeared remarkable. Yet somewhere beyond the fading sunset, preparations were already underway for a ceremony that would bring together two lives separated by 14 years, but forever connected by a simple decision made beneath an old bus shelter. Ethan still believed he had only shared a few breakfasts with a lonely child. He had not yet realized that the greatest stories are rarely measured by what we give, but by what another heart is finally able to believe because we gave it. Friday arrived beneath a clear autumn sky washed clean by the previous night's rain. Ethan had not worn a suit in more than 20 years. Standing in front of the small hallway mirror, he adjusted the silver tie for what felt like the 10th time before quietly admitting defeat. Hannah stepped behind him, smiling the way only daughters could smile at fathers who still believed they could solve everything themselves. "Hold still," she said gently. Within seconds, she straightened the knot, smoothed the collar, and stepped back with quiet satisfaction. Ethan looked uncomfortable rather than proud. "I feel like everyone is going to know I am pretending." Hannah laughed softly. "Dad, you have spent your whole life pretending you were ordinary." Ethan shook his head with a modest smile. "Because I am." She reached over and slipped Noah's handwritten note into the inside pocket of his jacket. "Then carry this with you. It tells a different story." A black government vehicle arrived. Precisely at 8 o'clock. The driver greeted Ethan with the same respect he might have shown a distinguished public servant. During the drive to the airport, Ethan watched familiar neighborhoods pass by the window. Children waited for school buses. Gardeners trimmed hedges. Dog walkers crossed quiet intersections. Everything looked wonderfully ordinary. It comforted him to know the world continued exactly as it always had. The airport experience felt entirely unfamiliar. Representatives guided him through private entrances with remarkable courtesy, yet nobody treated him as though he were more important than anyone else. That detail mattered to Ethan. Respect without arrogance always felt genuine. As the aircraft climbed above the clouds, he looked through the window at the endless blanket of white stretching toward the horizon. He remembered Noah once asking whether clouds looked different from above. Ethan had answered that he did not know because he had never flown before. The memory brought a quiet smile to his face. Somewhere far ahead, another young man was probably remembering the very same conversation. By early afternoon, the skyline of Washington emerged beneath the descending aircraft. Wide avenues, monuments gleaming beneath the autumn sun, rows of historic buildings, and trees dressed in shades of amber and crimson stretched in every direction. Ethan had seen photographs throughout his life, yet seeing the nation's capital with his own eyes felt strangely humbling. It reminded him that millions of quiet stories had shaped the country long before his own ever would. A small motorcade met him outside the terminal. Caroline greeted him warmly before guiding him into the waiting vehicle. "How was your flight?" she asked. "Peaceful," Ethan replied. "Still difficult to believe." Caroline smiled knowingly. Some moments need time before they begin to feel real. As they drove through the city, Ethan admired marble memorials, historic churches, and tree-lined streets glowing beneath the afternoon light. Tourists filled the sidewalks carrying cameras while school groups gathered around monuments listening carefully to volunteer guides. The city felt less like a place of power than a place carrying the memory of countless generations. Eventually, the vehicles entered a quiet government complex where security officers greeted the delegation with practiced professionalism. Ethan followed Caroline through wide corridors lined with portraits, historical photographs, and carefully polished wooden floors. The building was elegant without feeling extravagant. Every hallway seemed to whisper stories instead of announcing them. They finally stopped outside a pair of closed doors. Caroline turned toward Ethan. "There is someone waiting inside who has imagined this moment for many years." Ethan took a slow breath. His hands were steady, yet his heart beat faster than it had in decades. Before either of them could speak again, the doors opened quietly. At the far end of the sunlit room stood a tall man in a navy suit, his posture calm, his expression composed until his eyes met Ethan's. In that instant, every title, every achievement, every symbol of public service disappeared behind something infinitely simpler. The young official no longer looked like a respected advisor. He looked exactly like the thoughtful boy who had once carried worn library books beneath one arm, while trying not to let anyone notice he was hungry. Neither of them moved at first. Silence settled gently across the room, not awkward but deeply reverent, like the stillness inside an old church before the first hymn begins. Noah took one careful step forward, then another. His confident professional composure slowly gave way to unmistakable emotion. Ethan recognized the smile before anything else. 14 years had changed the face, strengthened the shoulders, and filled the eyes with experience, but the smile remained exactly the same. Noah stopped only a few feet away. His voice trembled slightly as he spoke the words he had carried in his heart since childhood. "Good afternoon, Ethan." Ethan smiled through glistening eyes, his own voice quiet and warm. "Good afternoon, Noah." For a brief moment, neither man reached for a handshake because some reunions belong beyond formality. Noah stepped forward and embraced the man who had once shared half a sandwich. Without asking for anything in return, Ethan returned the embrace with gentle affection, and every person quietly watching understood they were witnessing something no award could ever equal. 14 years earlier, one lonely child had discovered dignity beneath an aging bus shelter. Now two lives met again, not because one had become powerful, but because neither had forgotten what kindness sounded like when spoken without expecting applause. The ceremony was held in a stately room filled with warm afternoon light streaming through tall windows that overlooked rows of autumn trees glowing in shades of amber and gold. The atmosphere carried quiet dignity rather than celebration. There were no flashing cameras crowding the entrance, no loud music, no dramatic announcements. Instead, government officials, educators, community leaders, and a small group of invited guests spoke softly while taking their seats, as though everyone instinctively understood that the story bringing them together deserved reverence instead of spectacle. Ethan sat in the front row wearing the navy suit Noah had chosen for him. He still felt slightly uncomfortable in polished shoes that looked far too elegant for someone who spent most mornings pushing a cleaning cart across elementary school hallways. Every few moments he glanced around the room, wondering if perhaps someone more accomplished should have been sitting where he was. Noah noticed the familiar humility immediately and smiled to himself. Some things had never changed. When the program began, a senior official welcomed the audience before speaking briefly about service, integrity, and the quiet influence ordinary citizens could have upon an entire nation. Ethan listened respectfully but kept his attention on the people rather than the podium. Then Noah's name was announced. The room responded with warm applause as he stepped forward, calm and composed, carrying only a few handwritten pages instead of a prepared binder. He thanked the audience with a grateful nod before resting the papers on the podium. For several seconds he said nothing. His eyes slowly traveled across the room until they found Ethan sitting quietly in the front row. A gentle smile appeared. "People often ask me what inspired my career in public service," Noah began. "Some assume it was an exceptional teacher. Others believe it was an influential professor or a respected public official. They are all wrong." The room grew perfectly still. Noah continued, "The person who changed my life never stood behind a podium. He never appeared on television. He never wrote books or held public office. Most mornings he carried a mop in one hand and a lunchbox in the other." Several guests exchanged curious glances. Noah looked toward Ethan again before speaking more softly. 14 years ago, I was a frightened boy who believed I had become invisible. I owned almost nothing except a library card, a backpack, and the hope that history books might someday explain why difficult seasons eventually end. Every morning I sat beneath an old bus shelter pretending not to be hungry because I thought asking for help would cost me the last piece of dignity I still possessed. The silence inside the room deepened. Noah gently unfolded a faded napkin he had removed from his jacket pocket. Time had softened its edges, but it had been preserved with extraordinary care. The man sitting in the front row never treated me like a problem to solve. He never asked questions that embarrassed me. He never made me feel small so he could feel generous. He simply sat beside me, divided his breakfast into two equal halves, and said his daughter always packed too much food. I knew he was protecting my dignity, even then. Ethan lowered his eyes, overwhelmed by memories he had never imagined hearing spoken aloud. Noah's voice remained steady, but emotion quietly filled every word. Many people believe kindness changes lives because it provides something material. They are only partly correct. Food satisfies hunger for a few hours. Warm gloves protect against winter. But dignity does something far greater. Dignity teaches another human being that they are still worth believing in. That lesson never expires. He reached into his inside pocket once more and carefully held up an old library card inside a protective sleeve. I carried this with me through high school, through college, through graduate school, and into every office where I have ever worked. Whenever I doubted myself, I remembered a quiet janitor who believed I deserved respect before I had accomplished anything at all. A few audience members discreetly wiped tears from their eyes. No one looked away. No one checked a phone. Even the photographers lowered their cameras for a moment, recognizing that some memories deserved to be witnessed before they were recorded. Noah folded the library card back into its sleeve and looked directly at Ethan. If our nation wishes to build stronger communities, we must remember something remarkably simple. Policies matter. Institutions matter. Leadership matters. But before any of those things can truly succeed, someone must first look at a lonely child and quietly say, without ever speaking the words, "You matter." That happened to me because of one man who expected no reward. Everything I have accomplished began with that truth. When Noah stepped away from the podium, the room did not erupt into immediate applause. Instead, an extraordinary stillness settled over every chair, every face, every heart. It was the kind of silence that arrives only when people realize they have just witnessed something far more powerful than success. They had witnessed the lasting echo of ordinary kindness. For several long seconds after Noah stepped away from the podium, no one moved. The silence inside the room seemed to carry its own voice, filling every corner more powerfully than applause ever could. Sunlight filtered gently through the tall windows, casting warm patterns across the polished wooden floor, while autumn leaves drifted slowly outside, as though even the season itself had paused to witness the moment. Ethan remained seated with his hands folded quietly in his lap. He was not thinking about the audience, the distinguished guests, or the honor that had brought him to Washington. His thoughts had returned to an old plastic bus shelter, a faded backpack, and a boy who had once apologized for accepting half a sandwich. It amazed him how ordinary memories could grow into extraordinary consequences without announcing themselves along the way. Caroline stepped toward the podium and spoke softly. "Mr. Ethan Walker, would you please join us?" Ethan looked around as though she might be speaking to someone else. Hannah, seated beside him, smiled through tears and gently squeezed his hand. "Dad," she whispered, "they really do mean you." Ethan slowly rose to his feet. The audience stood with him, not because anyone instructed them to do so, but because respect often spreads quietly from one heart to another. The applause that followed was warm and sincere, yet Ethan seemed almost embarrassed by it. He offered a humble nod as he walked toward the front of the room with the same steady pace he used every morning while pushing his cleaning cart through school hallways. Noah waited for him with a grateful smile that carried 14 years of memories. When Ethan reached the stage, neither man immediately spoke. Noah reached into the inside pocket of his jacket and carefully removed something wrapped in soft blue cloth. He unfolded it with deliberate care before placing it gently into Ethan's hands. It was the old library card Ethan had once believed was lost forever. Time had faded the ink, and the corners were worn smooth from years of careful handling. Yet it had been preserved like a priceless family heirloom. Ethan looked at it quietly before raising his eyes toward Noah. You kept it all this time? Noah nodded. Every interview, every examination, every graduation, every difficult decision. Whenever I wondered whether I belonged in the room, I remembered that someone believed I mattered before I had accomplished anything. Ethan traced the edge of the card with his thumb. I thought I was only sharing breakfast. Noah smiled gently. You were sharing something much harder to find. He paused for a moment before continuing. You never asked why I had no home. You never asked what mistakes my family had made. You never treated me like someone who needed to earn kindness. You simply chose to see me. Ethan looked at the young man standing before him, now respected by leaders throughout the country, yet still carrying the humility of the thoughtful boy he had met years before. You did the hard part, Noah, he said quietly. You chose your future. Noah slowly shook his head. I chose to keep walking because you convinced me the road was worth taking. Emotion settled gently across the room once again. There was no dramatic music, no elaborate ceremony capable of improving what was already unfolding naturally between two people connected by simple goodness. Noah took another careful breath before speaking words he had carried in his heart for most of his life. I have been called many titles over the years. Student, scholar, advisor, public servant. But before any of those, I was simply a lonely boy who believed he had been forgotten. You changed that without ever asking for credit. You never treated me like a homeless child. You treated me like I already had a future. Ethan's eyes glistened as he answered softly. Because you did. Noah stepped forward once more, and they embraced again, this time not as a frightened child and a compassionate stranger, but as two men whose lives had quietly shaped one another across the years. Around them, many guests wiped away tears without embarrassment. They understood they were witnessing something larger than recognition. They were witnessing gratitude made visible. Hannah watched from the front row with quiet pride. She remembered the mornings her father packed 2 sandwiches instead of 1, never fully explaining why. She remembered washing old gloves before he carried them downtown. She remembered him staring thoughtfully out the kitchen window during winters when Noah had disappeared, always hoping the boy was safe somewhere. Now every unanswered question from those years had found its answer. Ethan gently placed one hand on Noah's shoulder and smiled with the same calm warmth that had first welcomed a lonely child beneath a weathered bus shelter. I am proud of you, he said simply. Noah smiled through grateful tears. Everything good that happened after we met began because one ordinary man quietly reminded me that I was never invisible. I have spent 14 years trying to become the kind of person who deserved the faith you placed in me that morning. I still am. In that moment, every person inside the room understood that the greatest legacy any human being could leave behind was not wealth, power, or recognition. It was helping another person believe they were worthy of hope before the world gave them any reason to believe it themselves. The return flight to Columbus was quieter than the journey to Washington. Ethan spent much of the afternoon looking out the airplane window, watching the clouds drift beneath the wings like endless fields of white stretching toward the horizon. The old library card rested safely inside his jacket pocket beside Noah's handwritten note. Every now and then he touched the pocket gently, not to make certain the keepsakes were still there, but because he still found it difficult to believe that the frightened boy beneath the weathered bus shelter had grown into the thoughtful man he had embraced only hours earlier. Hannah glanced toward her father with a warm smile. You have barely said 10 words since we left. Ethan chuckled softly. I am still trying to understand all of it. She leaned her head lightly against the seat. Maybe you do not have to understand everything today. He nodded. Perhaps you are right. When they arrived home that evening, the neighborhood looked exactly as it always had. Porch lights glowed warmly. Children rode bicycles beneath the fading sunset. A neighbor watered flowers near the sidewalk. Nothing about the street suggested that one of its residents had just returned from one of the most meaningful days of his life. Ethan appreciated that more than he could explain. The following Monday morning, long before sunrise painted the eastern sky, Ethan unlocked the front doors of Jefferson Elementary exactly as he had done for so many years. He wore the same comfortable work shirt, the same worn shoes, and the same gentle smile. The polished suit remained hanging neatly inside his closet. His cleaning cart waited where he had left it on Friday afternoon. He wrapped both hands around the familiar handle and quietly began another ordinary day. As students arrived, Many greeted him with cheerful waves. A little girl proudly showed him the missing tooth she had lost over the weekend. A fifth-grade student excitedly described winning his first soccer game. A nervous first grader held tightly to his mother's hand before Ethan knelt beside him and smiled. "You are going to do just fine," he said gently. "I believe you already know how to be brave." The little boy smiled back, and his shoulders relaxed just enough to walk toward his classroom with confidence. Principal Melissa Carter watched the exchange from across the hallway before walking over. "You know," she said with a smile, "after everything that happened in Washington, I thought you might take a few extra days off." Ethan laughed quietly while straightening a welcome mat near the entrance. Children still make muddy footprints on Monday mornings. Melissa folded her arms with amused admiration. Some people would have retired after a week like that. Ethan looked down the bright hallway where teachers welcomed another generation of students through open classroom doors. There is still work worth doing. Later that morning, a small package arrived in the school office addressed simply to Ethan Walker. Inside rested a framed photograph taken during the ceremony in Washington. It showed Ethan and Noah standing together, both smiling with quiet gratitude rather than celebration. Beneath the photograph was a handwritten note. "Dear Ethan, every important decision I make will always begin with one question. Does it protect the dignity of someone who feels unseen? Thank you for teaching me the answer before I ever learned the question. With enduring gratitude, Noah." Ethan smiled as he placed the framed photograph on a small shelf inside the custodial office beside Hannah's childhood drawings and an old family picture of his late wife. No trophies, no medals, no elaborate awards. Just reminders of the people who had given meaning to an ordinary life. Years later, visitors to Jefferson Elementary occasionally noticed the photograph and asked about it. Ethan always answered with the same humble words. "That is my friend Noah." He never mentioned Washington unless someone asked directly. He never described the applause, the ceremony, or the recognition. In his heart, those things had never been. The real story. The real story had happened years earlier beneath a worn bus shelter on a cold November morning when a lonely child discovered that compassion does not announce itself with grand speeches. It arrives quietly, carrying half a sandwich, a warm pair of gloves, a patient smile, and the unwavering belief that every human being deserves respect before they have earned anyone's admiration. Long after newspaper headlines faded and public memories moved on, the lesson remained unchanged. Greatness is rarely measured by the size of a title or the height of a stage. More often, it is measured by the quiet choices made when no audience is watching. A single act of kindness offered without expectation may travel farther than we will ever know, passing from one life into another until its influence reaches places we never imagined. Ethan Walker never set out to change the future. He simply chose to notice one child everyone else had learned to overlook. In doing so, he proved that dignity given freely never disappears. It grows silently across years, across generations, and sometimes even across a nation, reminding us that the strongest hearts are often the quietest ones, and that the greatest miracles begin the moment one ordinary person decides another person matters.